Is that video?
Okay,
We're
I
recording
zipped my lips.
Oh, no,
I'm
that's
done.
I don't believe it.
Oh,
You're going to introduce yourself.
I'll introduce myself.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Patrick Karen. I'm a member of the Historical Society, and I'm your speaker tonight. Normally I'm introducing somebody else, but I'm introducing myself. And I'd like to thank you for coming out tonight. And we're going to take a look back at the year 1938, and it is the 75th anniversary of Greenhills. So we're going to take a look back at this year, and not just minutia kind of stuff. I want to put it in the context of the decade as a whole and what it was leading into, because this is a pretty pivotal year, especially with international events. A lot of times I think in the U.S., when we think about the 30s, you know, we have those images of the bread lines and the apple sellers and FDR, but there's a lot going on overseas as well that's going to affect everyday Americans and is affecting them at the time. So put together a PowerPoint here that covers the year, but also leads into the year. I'll explain how I do that in just a minute. But there were some interesting themes coming up as I did this. One is the role of immigrants in American life. I know we have an issue with illegal immigration that I think needs to be handled in a sensible and humane manner. But immigrants were all immigrants in the U.S. Even the American Indians came from somewhere else long ago. And it's just amazing the contributions. And I think you're going to see that as we look at this year and as we look at the 30s. The role of the immigrants, what they've contributed to American culture. Another thing is that history, I think, really operates on a continuum. There might be a sudden turn in events like 50 years ago, JFK. That seems like such a turning point. You know, it seemed like the 60s sort of began after that. You know, things kind of might go forward, they might go back. I think of women's rights. Women were, all through the 1800s, you have movements for women's equality and freedom. It was a long, hard battle that people were fighting. And it was more active suffragette stuff in the early part of the century. In World War I, you saw women going into some defense plans like they would in World War II, getting the right to vote, you know, more sort of sexual freedom and things like that in the 1920s. But after World War II, you sort of see this movement where, you know, you have all these young GIs getting married and women having children and sort of being in the home. But that's really just a short period overall. These issues are still under the surface, and what's been building all that time is going to resurface dramatically in the 1960s. Okay, so just as an example about that continuum, and also just the struggle between individual freedom and the needs of the community, and you know, more communal kind of efforts and being part of a democracy versus pursuing those individual goals. Well, so we'll go ahead and get started here. I want to do something here, and I won't take a lot of time on it, but I had the idea of Greenhills in '38, the pioneer families who came out here. And originally I was going to kind of come up with a fictional kind of person who would, you know, represent like a young married couple, you know, coming out here with their family in '38, because a lot of these people might have been in their late 30s, early 40s. But I found a real example, Fred Paul, who was one of the very first Greenhills residents, because I saw his obituary and he died in 1987 and he was 87. Maybe he was about to turn 88. So he would have been born about 1900 or 1899.
Do you need to?
And I thought, if you arrived out here in '38, what have you seen already in your lifetime? What have you experienced as a person in like what, early middle age? So we're going to go back just briefly. In 1900, our president is William McKinley. He's the last Civil War veteran to be an American president, but he's one of a series. You know, starting with Grant, we had Hayes, Garfield, Benjamin Harrison, and then McKinley. And he's one of a sequence of Ohio presidents. We actually have 8 presidents from Ohio, if we include William Henry Harrison, who was actually born in Virginia, and the last president born a British subject. All right, but those would be Harrison, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Benjamin Harrison, McKinley, and then the other Ohio presidents would be William Howard Taft from Cincinnati, and then Warren Harding from up around Columbus, the Blooming Grove, Marion area. So Ohio plays an important political role. It still does in the country's life. But we have a whole, this time in our country, the Midwest is a powerful presence. It produces some of the most colorful politicians. Ohio has produced all these politicians, Grant on. I've mentioned them. There's some other people, Grover Cleveland from other places, Chester Arthur, but there's a whole group of presidents from Ohio in a pretty short period of time. And going into the 20th century, the Midwest is going to be part of there's going to be a big Midwestern literary explosion. So people in LA or New York who think they just fly over us, there's a lot more going on in the Midwest in Cincinnati than you might think. William McKinley, his father was in the iron business. His grandfather had started that, pretty prosperous, became a lawyer, served all through the Civil War, distinguished himself in a number of battles, and one time at the Battle of Antietam, brought a whole wagon full of hot steaming food to troops who appreciated that, and that was particularly noted. So he's formed by this experience of the Civil War. Mark Hanna is sort of the kind of a man behind the throne, important Ohio political figure who helps William McKinley get to where he arrived. And so it's an interesting time. You've got a lot of interesting, colorful politicians from Ohio. And I mention this because something I'm going to tie in with the 1938 and the 30s, Ohio's had these important power players like the Taps who've had a big impact on political culture. When you think about Fred Paul being born, the Indian nations have just been recently subdued. This is a picture from Wounded Knee where you see these frozen bodies being stacked in this trench. And this is kind of a pitiful kind of thing. These people were pretty exhausted and worn out, were eventually surrounded and gunned down. And at this point, the frontier is essentially closed. You're still going to have a lot of stuff going on. You're going to have Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid operating into the early 1900s. But if you take this back to Columbus and the first encounters, a whole historical cycle has just ended here. We've got the Spanish-American War in 1898. There's a revolution in Cuba. There's people in that country that have been agitating in our country for a long time. This is where we start to step onto the world stage. Our State Department around this time was like an old house in Washington with like this grandfather clock in the front hallway and like a guy at a desk. Things are very basic, but with this action, we're going to kind of start stepping out onto the world stage more. And this is going to be, of course, we're going to win this thing pretty quickly. Take a good look at this picture. We acquire some territories with the Spanish-American War, like Guam, like the Philippines, but there is a rebellion in the Philippines, on the heels of the Spanish-American War. Some of this stuff gets pretty complex, but we crush this thing pretty ruthlessly. And what you're seeing is waterboarding. Waterboarding is nothing new. They called it the water cure. But this thing, they're forcing water into this rebel for the purpose of torture. Okay, so you think things are new, they've been around a while a lot of times. This was used in Vietnam too. A lot of times we let the South Vietnamese do it, but a guy would hold a canteen and do that. But there were atrocities on both sides. This is America encountering an Asian enemy, and there's a lot of racial dimensions to it. This is where the term gook really starts to emerge in the U.S. Armed Forces as a term for an Asian person. This is not forgotten in the Philippines. They remember our contribution in World War II, and Filipino guerrillas fought alongside us against the Japanese, but they have not forgotten this also. So that's part of their cultural memory. I mentioned Dan Evan. I want to show you just how young America is. My dad's here. His mother was born about 1895 in Mount Vernon, Ohio. Dan Evan is the man who composed the song Dixie. They think he used an existing melody and put his own words to it. Songwriters back then would just pass these things back and forth. There wouldn't be like these copyright laws and such. But as a little girl, and she died like in 1984, and so I knew her for a number of years, but she would see this guy when she was a little girl walking around Mount Vernon, Ohio. He returned there later in life, and he did all this blackface minstrelsy minstrelsy stuff, and was pretty poor, but I was able to buy a little farm. But think of Dan Emmett's father fought in the War of 1812. So here I am talking to this lady who saw this man who joined the U.S. Army back in the 1840s on the frontier and was like a fifer, and his father had fought in the War of 1812. So it kind of shows you just through the generations how young this country really is. It's a world often, you have a lot of nostalgia about the Victorian period. It did have its charm. Does anybody know who this woman is? Have you ever seen Ragtime, the movie, or the stage musical? She was a famous artist model named Evelyn Nesbit. She was seduced by a guy named Stanford White, a famous architect. It was kind of a date rape, really. She was drugged, and he had a big velvet swing in his apartment in Madison Square Garden. He would have his girls come up there, and they would swing in this thing, and they'd be plied with alcohol, and he really was a predator. But she married this guy named Harry Thaw, who was really jealous about what had happened, and shot Stanford White on the roof of Madison Square Garden, and it was a celebrated trial, and she kind of led kind of a sad life after that. But she was really strikingly beautiful, and there's almost kind of a cult of her on the internet. You can find a lot of pictures of her. You can see the harsh reality of this time, though. We have these appealing images, but you know, my daughter was up here a little while ago, and I was thinking, you know, particularly if she's been born a boy, you know, at a certain point, if our family's in a certain situation, it might be, you know, time to go off to the factory, time to go off to the mine. And you can see this boy's hand has been maimed. Child labor is an ugly reality at this time. Again, thinking about Fred Paul, the world he's born into. Few newsboys. A lot of times they lived in rooming houses, grew up pretty rough. You know, there weren't these protections. And that's something I want to tie in here. Is in the 30s, we're going to see this movement toward these protections and greater reform. But at this time, there's a huge reform movement going on. The muckrakers, trust busting, Teddy Roosevelt and Taft are going to be doing a lot of things. You might know this guy who wrote this book. He's going to pop up in the 30s again. It's about the stockyards in Chicago. He wrote it to convert people to socialism. He was a diehard socialist. It said he aimed for their heart and hit their stomach instead. They read about what they were eating. Real quickly, Coxey's Army. You know, just this huge inequality in the country. And this is a movement led by a guy out of Massillon, Ohio, to march on Washington to draw attention to the plight of the workers. And all these men join, and also a western wing of this forms. And this guy down here with the arrow is Jack London. Jack London grew up extremely poor in San Francisco. His mother was actually from Massillon, Ohio. She's kind of a black sheep of the family, married this guy who was like an astrologer. Jack was born in 1876. He grew up really rough on the Oakland waterfront, but luckily there was a librarian nearby, and he learned to love books and writing. But he had some excruciating jobs and things, just working in places like for 80 hours a week. One of the first strikes in American history was in the 1800s, early 1800s, and these guys just wanted a 60-hour week. That's all they were asking for. Okay, so it gives you an idea of how things have changed. But Jack joins up with this. Real interesting thing, because I'm going to mention another cultural figure at the end of this. There's a tension in him between individualism and the community. He's going to be one of the first writers to make $1 million from his work, but he also becomes a committed socialist. And just a quick thing about him, not long after that, he's on the road, riding the rails. He's near Niagara Falls. He gets arrested for vagrancy. I think maybe a couple days in jail or something. He gets arrested. He actually goes before a judge. He tries to be his own lawyer, and the guy's just like, well, forget it. 30 days in the Erie County Penitentiary. One of the worst places you can be in is a prison at this time. They're just really, if they're bad now, they're worse then. He's going to see all kind of floggings, beatings. He's going to see a young black man severely beaten and thrown down a flight of metal stairs and crashes and hits his head and is killed. This is this sort of unfettered America without, there's something to be said for these regulations and rules and things. Okay, you can just see some stats. America in 1900. We're right at a turning point here. I like the thing about the catalog having nothing related to automobiles. If you're a make harness or something, your days are pretty well numbered at this point. Not that there isn't work for you, but some of these small towns would have like a guy who just did harness and saddles and things. William McKinley shakes hands for hours on New Year's Day in 1900. You can just go by the White House and get in line, shake hands with the president. And so you can see that young Fred Paul is growing up with all kinds of rapid change. And we're transitioning from this, mostly rural. I mean, the country's really going to be rural, largely through World War II. But all these forces are in play, okay? And there's a lot of good and a lot of bad. These factories provide jobs for immigrants and other workers and native-born workers. But they're brutal places. You get used up pretty quick. You saw the child labor. We're also setting that foundation for that industrial powerhouse we're going to be that's going to help us win World War II. Okay? All right. Powered flight. The Titanic, kind of a forerunner of the debacle that's going to happen in a couple of years over in Europe. Mustard gas, you really see the mechanized warfare, World War I. It's going to start off with guys on horseback, sort of traditional, and it's going to get pretty brutal pretty quickly. Up in Canada or over in England or France more obviously, but even up in Canada, the memory of this is stronger. We didn't come in until several years in, but World War I, incredible casualties, all this stalemate, trenches, rats, gas. April 17, we enter. We're going to make the Kaiser dance. I love this picture. They would do this at the time. These are all individual people, thousands arranged to form this Uncle Sam.
Oh, for goodness sake.
And this is Camp Lee, Virginia, I think it said. I've seen some other photos. They would do this. I mean, somebody would go to the work of putting all this together. And I've seen some other ones where they form like a sort of a shield with stars and stripes. But that's like tens of thousands of people being lined up. We're going to run into all what the Europeans have been dealing with. And then shell shock. There's some interesting stuff on YouTube, British documentary about shell shock, where these guys would be, it wasn't like you would take a hill or you fight about it, it would kind of be over. You had this stalemate, and you could just spend days being pounded with artillery shells. And there's stories of guys who 1 week had gone out and, did some serious, fighting and won some medal, and a week later they were kind of out of commission because they kept jerking. They couldn't stop these ticks or, repeated motions and stuff. Flu pandemic, you'd be fine in the morning and gone later on that night. It took people quickly. Then we hit the 20s. We got Scott and Zelda here. And of course, I just want to point out, a lot of people didn't live this life. They were, it's like the 60s. And when I taught middle school, I had these kids about the 70s, like everybody had an afro and was like disco dance and stuff. And it's like, no, it was kind of, it wasn't that, maybe for some people. And some people felt a lot of, depression and stuff after Vietnam, and there was a lot of conflict. But we kind of had these shorthand images for the time. So this is all that, he's growing up with.
I'm playing tennis.
Again, I think there's something to be said for those regulations and rules. And they're playing tennis up there. They're actually wired. They've got cables around their legs. But I was talking to a man who teaches at UC. He's probably in his early 60s, and his father was quite a bit older when he was born, but he said his dad did stuff like this. Did these stunts, and he said they were just kind of like these motorized kites. And one time they crashed, he lost all his teeth, but luckily he survived. And if you think this one's nuts, this guy's getting ready to jump from one to another.
Oh my gosh.
So, you know, obviously the plane is a big part of World War I. And it's actually sometimes these guys, you know, throwing bombs with their hand out the side. Okay? It's pretty primitive. And then the crash. Veterans of the First World War were promised a bonus. It was supposed to make up the difference between what a civilian worker got and a service man or woman received. When the Depression comes, they're thinking, hey, if we're starting to bail out banks and stuff like that, this is during the Hoover administration, what about us? We like to get that bonus now. They converge on Washington. Eventually, a lot of them are dispersed, but a core of about 2,000 to 3,000 remain. And the police try to get them out. But then MacArthur, General MacArthur, comes in, and he's going to disperse these folks with tear gas. So you have the U.S. Army attacking former former members of the Army or military and vets, and there's an 11-week-old baby that's killed. One vet's ear is severed. There's all these sort of gas-related injuries. It plays into FDR showing up in the White House later on. It's just a public relations nightmare. 1931, these guys are accused of rape, riding in a train. There's a group of men, there's a couple white girls. Later on they accuse these guys of rape. One of them recants and actually sides with them on their fight. This is going to take decades to unravel. It's one of the great, not great in a positive sense, but you know, one of the just incredible racial miscarriages of justice along racial lines in the past century. Yay. Boo. Okay. I just want to talk briefly about this. That's Ernest Hemingway on the far left. I don't think this gets enough credit or attention. Spain fought this civil war for about 3 years. What had happened was this old government was dissolved, and they put in, I think it's called the Second Republic, and it's much more of a leftish kind of government. And you've had problems in Spain for decades. And you know, here's this major European nation, and basically Franco, he's actually overseas at the time, is going to lead a coup against this new government, and it's going to be pretty much backed by landowners, the Catholic Church, and the military. All right, and it's interesting because it's like a fascist government that's going to emerge, but it's like very pro-Catholic. And I just read an article today. There's this place over in Spain called, I can't remember, it's the Valley of the something. I can't remember the title, but it's like this where Franco's buried, and all these victims of the Spanish Civil War are buried. But apparently it's mainly the fascist victims, and a lot of these Republican guys helped build it. It's sort of like almost slave labor, and it's still controversial. But anyway, you have the Republicans, who are more the socialist, anarchist, and so on, and then the nationalist, Franco and his forces, aided by Mussolini and Hitler. They're going to come in here, back Franco, test a lot of weapons, and there's going to be atrocities on both sides, and eventually it's going to lead to Franco's success, and he's going to govern until like 1975. So it's after Hitler and Mussolini are gone, he's there. Okay, just Manchuria is a disputed area between Japan, Russia, and China. Japan finds a pretext to go in there and seize this. Later, they're going to find another excuse to start a war with China, the Sino-Japanese War. One of the most infamous chapters is this. December 37, when they take Nanking, and there's just an orgy of rape, pillage. People are used for bayonet practice, beheadings, burying people alive. It's just really hideous. And you know, I appreciate the Japanese view of the atomic bombing, but they've kind of whitewashed some of their history a little bit. Not a little bit, a lot, I'd say. This is a famous picture from the time. Mussolini goes into Ethiopia. Again, they're kind of finding an excuse to acquire territory. And fighting the Ethiopian army is really really like a boy going after a little kid. Some of these Ethiopian tribes with bows and arrows and spears. And you have Italy with its coming in from Italian Somaliland and Eritrea and just stomping out the Ethiopian resistance. And the Emperor Haile Selassie is going to say, today it is us, tomorrow it's going to be you. All right? So he has no illusions about these fascist dictatorships and what they're trying to do. Famous quote by FDR. Of course, the Dust Bowl. Just going to give you a couple quick statistics. There's a long drought that started in 30, but it's really abetted and aided by our lack of stewardship. And there's concern about this happening again. There's been a lot of overgrazing. There hasn't been good soil conservation. And so we have these incredible dust storms. Even leads to a certain kind of illness called dust pneumonia. And you just see these pictures of these towns and barns and stuff buried in dust. Just about 2.5 million people displaced from the Plain States during this time. And in 1934, Oklahoma lost about 400,000 alone. These were springing up around cities from all the unemployed. Again, you have very little support systems for people who are in need. You know, you just don't have all the safety nets that we do now. Upton Sinclair, he's been at it since early 1900s. He didn't stop with the jungle. He's always writing some thinly disguised fiction, you know, attacking somebody like Henry Ford or the oil industry, or writing about Sacco and Vanzetti. And so he's going to run for governor of California. He wants to he wants the state to like lease or acquire like old factories and stuff, let the workers run them. The state would buy up, you know, surplus crops, and it would be this trade, trying to set like a state co-op. He even writes this book, I, Governor of California, and How I Ended Poverty, and a True Story of the Future. And so he has some nerve in a way, because this is incredibly threatening. And he's actually going to get like the Democratic nomination. And it's this movement called EPIC, End Poverty in California. It's got Roosevelt really worried. The studio heads in California don't like this at all. And they're going to make some of the first negative ads. It's going to be targeting him. He said something like, if I get elected, you know, a lot of the unemployed in America are going to flock here. So they make these like propaganda movies showing all these bums getting off trains and showing up in small California towns and stuff. So, didn't work out. There's Mussolini's in power. We have Stalin. This is a guy over in England. Originally was more of a left-wing guy. And Oswald Mosley leads the British Union of Fascists. So there's this whole thing where, like, out of World War I and all this breakdown, and you know, it was really European civilization was just sort of shattered. And all these old certainties were gone. All these old structures had been shaken. And so, and democracy is messy and confusing. And so there's this natural desire sometimes for people to have like a strong man and a strong, undisputed rule, and get away with this get away from this ambiguity and stuff, and have clear law and order. And eventually he's going to go down that route. Even in Ireland, there's a guy who's going to form these blue shirts. He's going to take a unit over to Spain. They're going to fight with Franco. And of course, this guy, Huey Long, he's going to become governor of Louisiana. He's going to play on all that resentment that people have. Every man a king, and he really wants to get into redistributing wealth. And he's got to get my bifocals, but he's talking about, like, you know, he eventually wants to have things with get everybody to have like an annual income of $2,000 to $3,000 a year, 1 month vacation. He has all these great ideas, but it's at the cost of him having like dictatorial powers. And so he's going to be governor, become a U.S. senator from Louisiana, install a puppet in the governor's office and continued to run Louisiana from Washington. And Roosevelt is concerned, and he starts the FBI and other people investigating Long. And they're going to go after him on one thing. He charged a 2-cent tax on newspapers that was found to be in violation of freedom of the press. He called it like a 2-cent lie tax. You know, he didn't want anybody questioning him, but he's going to be assassinated. But you know, he really started to get some traction and really appealed to a lot of Democratic voters. But he was taken out. And then the radio priest, Father Coughlin, was very pro-FDR at first, but then became really anti-Semitic. He talked about the Jew deal. He would use that term. Sometimes you hear people at the time where these like demagogues calling Roosevelt Rosenfeld. There's all this anti-Semitic stuff. Of course, you're going to have the German-American Bund in America. You're going to have pro-fascist movements here. One's called the Silver Shirts. But he was a pretty nasty character and operated out of Royal Oak, Michigan. He was on about 35 stations at one point. And I think you know these events. And this guy spent some time up in Hamilton for a while, John Dillinger. So this is all our background leading up to Greenhills. This is the world Fred Paul is seeing, if only from a distance. In the early 30s, we might kind of laugh at this now, these dance marathons, people competing for a prize. You read some of the accounts of these, are really kind of depressing. People were like willing to do anything to get a little money. And there's just reports of people just seeing one of these things toward the end, and people just out there exhausted, their feet swollen, garbage all over the ballroom or whatever. Some people started to look this way for answers. And finally we come onto the scene. You can tell our history is full of all this economic growth, but all kinds of chaos. You know, sometimes a railroad would overbuild, or there would be over speculation, or there'd be a yellow fever epidemic. Just all kinds of things could play havoc with the economy, and it's also very decentralized. So you'll have a lot of instability. And labor strife, of course, too. You know, people even in white-collar corporate jobs having an 8-hour day, and a lot of these things come out of these people who fought in coal mines and things, and fought for workers' rights. Here we are. We're going to get the bad news out of the way. I was telling my family, if this stuff hadn't been so serious, one thing, I didn't want to make, because of the Holocaust and stuff is up here, but I was tempted to put at the bottom of this, Bernie Madoff born. Bernie Madoff shows up this year. And I couldn't resist that about oil discovered in Saudi Arabia, since we've been entangled over in that part of the world for so long. New England hurricane, tremendous damage, especially on Long Island. This comes later in the year, I think it was in September. Losses today would be in the range of $4.7 billion. And so some of this damage and wreckage lasted into the early 50s. So it's just this huge catastrophic storm, leveled like huge chunks of forest up in Massachusetts and so on. You just see some things here. I just want to mention the second one. 5 people died at this thing on that beach in Australia, but this was incredible because these waves came in and just pulled these people out. And those Australian lifeguards went into action immediately. It was just very difficult because some of these people were panicked, and there were so many of them. And so they ended up saving like 200 plus people. And it was just amazing effort of life-saving. They just sprung into action. And so the people out there thrashing around, there are these waves, but there's so many of them. Then you have huge floods and landslides in LA. And then you had this accident over in Japan. Okay. Hitler's been on the move. He's been consolidating power. He comes to power in the early 30s. But he's geared for what he called Lebensraum, living space, expanding Germany's borders. And there's a strong connection with Austria, ethnically and historically and so on. And eventually in March, he's going to acquire Austria through pretty much non-violent means. There's going to be a lot of negotiation, and there's this sort of so-called vote on it. But one historian wrote, if you hear Austrians complaining about Hitler, remember pictures like this, that we were the first one he took. There was a lot of welcoming of these forces into Austria. And Hitler, of course, is Austrian himself. I probably would retitle this The Acquisition of Czechoslovakia. It's not so much an invasion, but this is the whole Munich crisis. He wants to acquire the Sudetenland, which is this German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. There's going to be all this negotiation back and forth. Britain's involved. And to kind of show you how slimy all this stuff is, one of the British delegates offered to Hitler, because Europeans had all these colonial powers, if you stay away from your borders, we all have a lot of control of Africa. We're going to form a consortium to govern Africa, and we're going to give you a big chunk of that, okay? And Hitler's like, no, I want to expand. So Hitler's going to basically come in here, take the Sudetenland, and later on he's going to snap up a lot of the rest of this. The notorious, this is the actual quote, peace for our time. Neville Chamberlain. It's sometimes called the rape of Czechoslovakia. They appease Hitler. This is the famous appeasement, the famous Munich crisis, all this negotiation. Are we going to fight? Are we not going to fight? And of course, he's only appeased for a while. Spain, this is 1938 here. Battle of the Ebro. This is a last great Republican offensive. They cross this river. They're trying to, keep going, but they're ultimately smashed by Franco's forces, and they're going to be pushed back. An interesting chapter of our history, we had guys go over to Spain from here. A lot of them were communists or socialists. They came from all walks of life. Some of them were Jews and Greeks and Finns from immigrant families. Some of these immigrants had stronger socialist traditions in their family. A lot of the socialist movement started over in Europe. So some of that was part of their background, especially as working people. So socialism and communism were ideas that were familiar in a lot of these families. So you had this group called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Notice that this is an integrated unit, unlike the U.S. military at this time. And again, a lot of these guys are young radicals. Some of them are going to fight in World War II. One is a very gifted soldier, an excellent soldier named Robert G. Thompson, who's going to fight in the U.S. Army in World War II, win the Distinguished Service Cross at New Guinea, but he's going to return to his activism after the war, and is initially denied burial in Arlington. And it becomes this debate, can a guy be buried in Arlington even though he was a communist? And I think basically the government sent his ashes to his wife and said, you do what you want, okay? So anyhow, George Orwell fought with the Republican forces in Spain. So did this guy, was one of the Hollywood 10 blacklisted during the McCarthy era. So a lot of stuff from this 30s time, it's going to show up in the 50s, because a lot of these folks flirted with communism, toyed with it, maybe joined the party, maybe weren't real serious about it, but later on, they're going to be questioned about it. Kristallnacht, well, I just saw some stuff in the news recently. Hitler's been doing things for a while in terms of, mistreating people and asserting his power, but a lot of times this is pointed to really as the start. Okay, on to some good news. January that year, we might think of jazz a lot of times now as sort of a highbrow kind of music in a lot of ways, very sophisticated. It's a big deal when Benny Goodman plays at Carnegie Hall. This is a really famous jazz concert. You can see a record sleeve here. Hell's a Poppin' is a revue that opens on Broadway. It's going to run for about 1,400 performances. It's just a lot of kind of slapstick comedy stuff, but it's something that starts in '38 and goes for a number of years. And Mary Martin is going to make her stage debut this year. She's got a 7-year-old son named Larry Hagman, of course, at this time. And she's going to sing this "My Heart Belongs to Daddy," and that's going to become a real showstopper. And this is a Cole Porter production. And it's kind of a strange thing because it deals with like commies and Nazis, okay, to put it bluntly. There's this whole thing about this guy's ambassador to Russia or something, and he doesn't really want to be there, and he's trying to get fired. And there's this thing where she's at this like train station in Russia and kind of does this mock striptease thing with furs, and she does this "My Heart Belongs to Daddy." And so it's kind of like politically incorrect later on, but it's going to be revived later on in the 80s. But this is going to become a big number for her. And this fellow made his debut at the time. I like that picture of him. And Glenn Miller is going to form his jazz orchestra. I think there's 20 plus Irving Berlin songs in this. Tyrone Power on the left, Alice Faye. Tyrone Power, of course, from Cincinnati, Ohio. I heard he still has relatives in this area. Went to Purcell High School and also was a pilot in the Marine Corps in World War II. He died pretty young, really. I think in his 40s, about 44 or so. But he's like this young society kid who wants to become a musician, but he's drawn to ragtime instead of like classical music. And it kind of goes all the way up through the swing period. And Irving Berlin also this year on Armistice Day, with these gathering storm clouds over in Europe, Kate Smith is going to premiere "God Bless America." Irving Berlin actually wrote this back in about 1918 when he was in the Army for a review, but it was more of a comic show they were doing. He didn't really think it fit in, but this is going to become, you know, one of our most treasured songs. And Kate Smith, of course, is the songbird of the South. Aaron Copland is going to create his famous ballet Billy the Kid that has a lot of the sort of Western cowboy kind of orchestral music. And then "By Mir Bist Du Shane," which is a Yiddish song, is going to become the first hit for the Andrews Sisters this year. And an interesting thing about that immigrant heritage, I'll tell you about the Lincoln Brigade.
I didn't know that was their first hit.
It's interesting about these women, just these interesting things that happen in America. A Greek Catholic father and a Norwegian Lutheran mother. And they have these 3 daughters, and they become a huge success. And really part of America's cultural, you know, treasures, you know, not just the great recordings, but just the many, many hours of touring for the troops in World War II. Just they really were on the road a lot, performing munitions factories, camps, and so they really, the soundtrack of that era, their music is part of that. They were very much beloved by veterans. Some big hits. You might know some of these. "Whistle While You Work," coming out of Snow White. Laura Lee, it's the same melody of "Love Me Tender" that Elvis did. Got Roy Acuff, and then Bob Hope's "Thanks for the Memory," and Bing Crosby with "On the Sentimental Side." This might be something a little different I wanted to throw in here. Have you ever heard the legend about the blues man who goes to the crossroads and sells his soul to the devil? And this is one of the great all-time American bluesmen, Robert Johnson. If you ever saw Crossroads with Ralph Macchio, he's referenced here. We know a lot more about him now, but apparently they think he was poisoned by a jealous husband. He was about 27 years old, but left behind these seminal blues recordings. Robert Johnson. I always get confused with the Academy Awards. I remember it's the previous year, the movie from the previous year. Life of Emile Zola is going to have Paul Mooney, great actor, comes from the Jewish family. Again, that immigrant tradition. There's a guy who played Scarface in the original Scarface. And I'm a fugitive from a chain gang. All right, probably familiar.
This was in 38, huh?
I think her real name was like Frances Ethel Gum or something like that. But she's announced she's going to play Dorothy. They're working on the script. Filming will begin in October. Interesting trivia, some of you might know this because it seems like it gets talked about more. Buddy Epson is the original Tin Man, but he's going to suffer an almost near fatal reaction to this makeup. I think it has like aluminum in it.
Wow.
And he comes really close to checking out.
Huh.
This is him as the Tin Man, and here's from a screen test. You can see I always see him as Uncle Jed. So I find it interesting to see him as a young guy. And some of you may know these, some popular films. Spencer Tracy's going to win the Academy Award 2 years in a row. Captain's Courageous, and then Boys Town, and young Mickey Rooney. Errol Flynn. While preaching to the choir here, I'm sure you know this stuff. Clark Gable, Myrna Loy, and Spencer Tracy. FDR was a big Myrna Loy fan. She did apparently become a staunch Democrat later on. I think it was later on. I don't think she was beforehand, maybe, but maybe that helped. And this is sort of, Spencer Tracy's the buddy. Clark Gable's kind of the main lead, and this whole thing about, he marries Myrna Loy, she's worried about him flying, and sort of this drama. Boy, that's one of those faces you never forget.
Yeah, thank you.
Pat O'Brien is the priest. They have a history that goes back to childhood. You might remember this is the one where Pat O'Brien wants him to go away to the electric chair crying and screaming and acting like a coward, so the kids on the street who worshipped him will not go into a life of crime.
Yeah.
Interesting thing too about Cagney, again, that immigrant thing, that Irish thing. Also, Cagney learns to speak Yiddish growing up in New York. He's around so many young Jewish kids. So again, just that American melting pot I find keeps showing up as I look over this. I've never seen this one. Loretta Young up there. Richard Green, a British actor, got Walter Brennan. Sort of this drama down in Kentucky, sort of a Romeo and Juliet thing. Walter Brennan and his older relatives had some fight with Richard Green's family, and now the young lovers make it all work out. And of course, here's our winners. They come out in '39. Classic Frank Capra. He's going to get Best Director. It's second year in a row for him. And I love this picture, the classic. He's really got the Betty Davis eyes in this one. Jezebel, set down in the South, antebellum South. And on a different note, Paul Ray Lawrence is a documentary filmmaker. He makes a film called The Plow That Broke the Plains, about the Dust Bowl. And this is really the government working with these young filmmakers. You've got this whole movement with, I'll talk a little bit about it in a second, but the artists working with the government, filmmakers, writers, painters. We see it in this building with our murals. This is about like the TVA and the Mississippi and flood control and things like that. Daffy Duck, he'd been in an earlier cartoon, but this is sort of, he's officially baptized and named now. Daffy Duck, and this is the prototype for Elmer Fudd.
Oh.
So, the old Merry Melodies cartoons. And then, of course, premiered late '37, released nationally in '38, early '38, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, classic Walt Disney animation. This is a short from 1938 called Catnip College. And speaking of that American music, like that Alexander's Ragtime Band, these two cats here, the boy cat on the left, he's at college, he's in a swingology class, and he just doesn't have the rhythm, and the girl gives back his fraternity pin, but later on that night he hears this like cuckoo clock. He starts kind of stomping his feet. He's got the rhythm, and he's going to become the head cat or whatever.
Oh, Superman shows there.
Two guys out of Cleveland, two young men, one born there, one originated up in Canada. Again, that's that immigrant tradition. These two young Jewish guys, Siegel and Schuster, create this character. I mention that because some people have looked at this from a more serious level. Superman's kind of an immigrant too. He comes from this other planet. He's got this sort of biblical name, Kal-El, and there's Jor-El and stuff, almost like something in the Middle East. He's going to become adopted by this American family, but he's going to learn these values. He has all this knowledge that he learns in this new culture to use his knowledge and fight for truth, justice, and the American way. And there they are. Siegel and Schuster. Mary Worth, she started bugging people and butting into their lives way back in 1938.
Wow.
I just never had figured out this thing. She seems like she just kind of interferes with people. I know the Inquirer dropped it years ago. I think it's still going. It is?
Detroit.
In Detroit it is. But it actually comes out of an earlier strip called Apple Mary, which really has a depression kind of motif to it. She's like this old lady selling apples, and she's kind of kindly, and she kind of, despite her own predicaments, helps other people, and then sort of becomes this busybody later on. Dick Tracy starts in the early 30s, becomes a big hit. And Al Cap with Little Abner is going to have that character Fearless Fosdick, which kind of parodies Dick Tracy. And there's kind of this sort of love-hate relationship between these two cartoonists about that. But eventually getting into like making movies and cartoon serials and things. This comes out in 1938. I like that poster. And Blondie. Interesting thing about Blondie. When Blondie starts, it's early 1930s. She's kind of this like airhead character. You read it now, she's the paragon of common sense, and he's this goofball husband, and she's always kind of shaking her head. You kind of see her just tapping her foot right here at something he's done. But he was like this kid from a wealthy family, marries this flapper, and who's kind of goofy, and gets disinherited, has to go to work, and they kind of slide into the middle class, and it's going to change, of course. And now you see in the paper, you'll see him at work, and he's got his laptop or whatever, so they've adjusted. But they made a series of movies. Radio, obviously huge. We had no televisions yet. The TV's being developed at the time. Edward R. Murrow. And this guy, really brilliant broadcaster, spoke fluent German and French, I believe. And during that Munich crisis, became part of everybody's lives, because you turn on the radio, and H.V. Kaltenborn reporting from Europe. And one guy joked, he said he could wake this guy up, and he started talking about Munich, because he could just talk. It's like the Wade Hoyt kind of thing. He could just talk off the top of his head about this stuff and knew so much about it, and just did these famous reports. And Americans got to know this guy, which plays into this, because he's going to debut as Mercury Theater of the Air in that summer with Bram Stoker's Dracula. But if you saw that PBS thing a few weeks ago about this, they mentioned there seemed to have been this psychological effect where people were primed for this because they've been listening to this Munich crisis stuff with like guys like H.V. Kaltenborn, and it's tense. And what is this Hitler going to do? And Churchill is kind of shunned by people over in England for kind of standing up and speaking out, and so there's this kind of this underlying anxiety that people have. And of course, you're going to have the famous Panic broadcast on October 30th. And a lot of people apparently switched from Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. After that routine was over on another station, they switched and they hear about this attack in New Jersey of these aliens. And it sounds like a real news broadcast. They're actually not going to be permitted to use that kind of device and broadcast for a while. Johnny Vandermeer is going to have his 2 back-to-back no-hitters. We cover a little sports news here. We don't think about UC Berkeley being a football powerhouse, but they had some good teams back then. When I hear Berkeley, I just think hippies and stuff, think of the 60s. But they're going to win the 38 Rose Bowl over Alabama. 2 classic old teams. I'm not going back to the open face helmets with all these concussion things I've heard. And then Yankees over the Cubs. When will the Cubs ever win the World Series? And then this one probably. Seabiscuit. Classic underdog story. Defeats War Admiral. And I was reading about this today, and I've just been trying to, studying all this stuff. Some of it I was familiar with, a lot of things, not so much. But, this was a rematch. And there's so much political stuff behind this. And you had the thing with Jesse Owens in the Olympics, where it's a big thing. This black man wins this triumph, and Hitler is disgusting. You know, it's a rebuttal or a rebuke of that whole Aryan kind of thing. When Joe Louis is defeated the first time, I read the poet Langston Hughes wrote, he walked out on the street, this is in Harlem, and men were weeping. And so women on the curb with their heads down. There was so much hope behind Joe Louis. And here's this guy from Nazi Germany, and he takes Joe out. He'd studied him very carefully. He knew there was a certain move he made where he dropped his hand, and he exploited that like a good fighter would. He's done his research. When Louis comes back, also Louis did not take him seriously apparently in the first fight, and was goofing off a lot and didn't really train. He trains really hard. He says, I'm going to take this guy out like in the first round. I'm going to try to do it quick. And he does. He takes him out in the first round. They're actually going to be good friends though. And Schmeling is a German, but he's never like a real pro-Nazi kind of guy. And Hitler kind of punishes him, eventually puts him in the German army as a paratrooper. Howard Hughes is going to set an aviation record. July 14th. They returned to New York after circling the globe in 3 days, 19 hours, 14 minutes, and 10 seconds. And this guy, I really enjoyed learning about him because he's going to duplicate Lindbergh's feat, only he's going to land in Ireland. And he just looks to me like a leprechaun or something. He's an Irish-American guy. But this guy's a very experienced airplane mechanic and pilot. And his story is that he'd flown from California to New York, and that there was this navigational error, and he had no idea that he was going to land over in Ireland. And he lands near Dublin, and and some aviation historians would say this is more impressive than Lindbergh because he has a much more beat-up, antiquated plane that he's flying. And there's just some other little nuances they've teased out about this. And he's sort of given this sort of slap on the wrist, but then he gets a ticker tape parade and stuff too when he gets back, and plays himself in a movie about a year later. And always says, I had no idea. It just happened. And FDR met him and said, I really believe what you say. I absolutely believe what you did, but it was incredible. One of the great classics. It's so accessible, this play. That's why it's been done to death. People can relate to it. Our Town opens. It's going to win the Pulitzer. John Marquand. This novel wins this sort of a lot of these people are sort of underrated. I think they deserve more attention. There's a lot of good books from the past worth reading. This guy's better known for creating this fictional, I think it's a Chinese-American detective named Mr. Moto. And so he's better known for writing for what they call the slicks, like Collier's and Cosmopolitan, and writing these stories about Mr. Moto. But he comes from this family in New England that sort of slid into this genteel poverty, and he writes a lot about the social structure of like old Boston and the Bostonians and this sort of wealth that's like in decline. Got a few visual aids here. Get away from the cyber world. This is actually a 37 edition. John Dos Passos wrote 3 books, a trilogy, looking at the United States from the turn of the century up through the 30s, and they have a lot of different kind of fictional techniques in them. Sometimes he throws in short biographies of people like Henry Ford or Isadora Duncan, but the overall theme is one of disillusionment. This guy is going to move from the political left to the right later on. He's going to write for like Buckley's National Review, and he's going to be like a Goldwater supporter. That's another thing that comes out of the 30s is this disillusionment, like the real far left kind of stuff, especially in the wake of what Stalin has done. Faulkner, The Unvanquished. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings writes The Yearling. You might know this. Famous story about a boy who sort of adopts a deer and really comes to love and care for it, but the deer starts to destroy a lot of their crops, and it has to be destroyed. And the father does. And just I'm doing a lot of spoiler, or I'm ruining a lot of stories for you here, but that theme of like growing up and having to deal with realities and things. And she moves down to Florida. She comes to know that area real well. I think Mary Steenburgen played her in the movie, I believe. So this was a bestseller in 38. This guy has a book called The Bridge in the Jungle. He has this whole series about these jungle novels, and this guy's, there's a lot to it, but I'll give you the shorthand version. This guy has always been real mysterious, and there's still debate about who he was. They think he was a German-American radical, born in like the 1890s, spent a lot of time in Mexico, but he's best known for this, of course, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. He wrote a lot of other stuff. I think his real name was Rhett Marut, and had always kind of been really shadowy, and apparently been like a laborer and a sailor and a merchant man and stuff, but wrote these novels about working class kind of figures struggling with authority and greed and so on. And Pearl Buck, I believe she's the second American to win the Nobel Prize, and the first woman. Toni Morrison is going to win it later on. Her work is being looked at again, especially by Asian American women writers, because she writes so sympathetically about China. Thomas Wolfe, famous Southern novelist, is going to die, tuberculosis that year. And then kind of our main man of the 30s, Steinbeck, is going to publish this book of short stories. But he's been out doing a series of articles about the Okies and the workers out in California. They're going to be published in a pamphlet form called Their Blood is Strong. And that year he starts to write The Grapes of Wrath, which of course is just one of the seminal works of the time. A little existentialism for you. I'm going to take a look overseas. Joan Paul Sartre publishes a book called Nausea. How's that grab you for a title? Is that something you want to read? An English novelist, Graham Greene. He also writes a lot of kind of thriller type stories, and he's going to work for British intelligence during World War II. This guy put out a lot of books. He wrote a book called The Quiet American, too, about our involvement in Vietnam. Came out in the early 50s. Features this disillusioned British correspondent with this idealistic American. He really gets a lot of flack for it at the time, but you look at it now and it's pretty prophetic. Rebecca, it's from the movie that comes out this year. And Orwell's going to publish his account of Spain in 38. Homage to Catalonia. I'm an English teacher, that's why I'm throwing all this stuff in here for you. Hemingway's got this play, The Fifth Column, also about Spain. These intellectuals and artists were really troubled by Spain. They really thought they saw fascism taken, really they saw its ugly face. There was Hitler, but they really saw it kind of already coming to fruition in Spain. And of course, Franco's going to rule to 75. And Richard Wright publishes Uncle Tom's Children this year. This is from the movie version. Play that came out in 38, Abe Lincoln in Illinois. I think that's Raymond Massey. And this guy, a real Renaissance man, Robert Sherwood, wrote this. He's written other plays, but he also writes speeches for FDR. And he's going to write a work of history that's going to get the Pulitzer Prize called Roosevelt and Hopkins later on.
Oh, wow.
So a really multi-dimensional kind of guy. Louis Bromfield from here in Ohio. You can visit Malabar Farm State Park today, where he came back from living in Europe for decades, coming back to his home area here in Ohio, up in like Richland County, up in the Amish country. Some of his earlier work, he's got novels set in Ohio, but he also has some novels set over in India and France. He's quite the cosmopolitan guy, but he's going to come back here and establish Malabar Farm around 39, and that's going to become an experimental farm, and it attracts a lot of celebrities. Jimmy Cagney comes to visit, and then most famously, Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall either get married there or honeymoon there. So, some nonfiction bestsellers. This is a Chinese guy, Lin Yutang. Just kind of learned about him doing this. Grew up in a Chinese Christian family. Later abandoned Christianity, came back to it later on, kind of wrote this self-help book that came out in 38. I was surprised to see that. And Mauro Lindbergh has a long writing career, also becomes a pilot. And then, did I bring it? Maybe not. Yes. This book alone by Richard Byrd, when they reprinted it back in the, I think, early 2000s, it has the kind of like the reproduction, like this sort of light blue pages that they have in the book. So, famous work about him up in Antarctica. This is a big bestseller this year.
Wow.
You know, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. This is a local guy who became a big fan of Carnegie and became one of the most notorious figures of the 60s. Does anybody know who this guy is?
Look at the eyes.
Anybody know who this innocent, well, maybe not so innocent looking, kind of mischievous looking, but this clean-cut American boy?
Jerry Springer?
Not Jerry Springer, not Jerry Rubin. It's Charles Manson.
Oh, for Christ. He was from Ohio. Oh my gosh.
This picture was taken. There's a new book out on Charlie. I'm talking like I know him, like he's my buddy or something.
I hope not.
Oh my gosh.
This guy's like a serious crime historian. It's not some kind of trashy true crime thing. I can't recall his name, but he's written like about the OK Corral and you know, the gangsters in the 30s. A serious biography about Manson, and he's interviewed some people who haven't been interviewed before, like one of Manson's sisters. And you see some pictures in there of this. He was married for a while, and he's in his early 20s. You see him again, it's like a guy in his 20s, the short hair, the suit. It's hard to believe. But apparently when this picture was taken, Charlie was about to go see a judge. Charlie is bad news from very early on. He had a, you know, I'm not apologizing for Charlie, but, you know, a psychologist years ago was asked if he ever felt, who worked with Charles Manson, said, do you feel sorry for him? He said, no, I feel sorry for the boy, Charles Manson. Apparently was sold as a baby one time for a pitcher of beer. The
Wow.
mother sold him away. A relative came and got the baby back. But he was kind of, it's just a bad story. But in this picture, he's about 10 or so. He's about to go see a judge. He's going to tell that she's raised in the Church of the Nazarene. That's his religious background. He's going to tell this judge that I'm a Catholic, and can you send me to Boys Town? And the judge is going to do that. And not long after there, getting out there, Charlie's going to steal a car and take off. So
Now, where did he live in Cincinnati?
I'm not sure where he lived. I don't think they ever knew his paternity at all. I've heard the mother was a prostitute. I've heard different things. That book would probably have some answers, but this author says that in Dale Carnegie's work, you see a lot of the manipulative tactics that Charlie learned in his life. And when he was at Alcatraz, he was a poor reader and student, but he signed up for this course and really got into it and really learned a lot of things. And one of Dale Carnegie's things is like, I think it's making the other person think it's their idea. And a guy who knew Charlie said he was really good at that. Getting you to do something, make you think it was your idea. You know, he never committed any of those murders. He got the other people to do them for him. Okay?
Charismatic.
Exactly. Should I just leave that up? What if it's PowerPoint calmed down? I don't okay. Just switching back to the books here. All those writers and artists and intellectuals getting involved. The government puts out this wonderful series of these guides to different cities, different states. They're chock full of information and history. Famous writers work on them like Richard Wright and Nelson Algren and other people who are going to become big names down the road. And this is sort of the original for Cincinnati. You can still find copies of it ranging from a few bucks to 99 bucks out there. It was reprinted in the late 80s or early 90s. But when you read them, you can see where things have changed, but they're really rich records of life in America at the time. And in the 30s, you listen to the radio a lot. You go to the library a lot more because you don't have money to buy books for a lot of people. And a lot of people read magazines. And so a lot of short stories. People read more short stories and poetry and things because these are part of these magazines at the time. And this is where guys like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and some of these famous people work in the noir tradition start off in this thing called Black Mask. A lot of these hard-boiled stories. Then there's weird tales. Science fiction is really, some of these genres are really developing at the time. You got young Ray Bradbury, who's 18 years old in 1938 reading this stuff. And some jobs we really don't see anymore. You could probably make a case for the person at UDF maybe being a little bit of a soda jerk, but remember that the soda fountain is like, that's just all they're doing, you know, is making those ice cream sodas and things. And it's a very particular destination.
Oh.
There's a famous picture of a soda jerk in 1939 in Texas. You know, some folks really had some skills. Pullman Porter. You know, most of the porters were black men. There were also Pullman maids, African-American women who worked on the trains. But some historians have credited these workers with developing a black middle class in America. They were widely respected and admired for their courtesy, their consideration, their attending to your every need. Some of the first ones had actually been slaves. They had been schooled to be these kind of servants. But you know, there's an argument made that they presented a very positive image of black America to a lot of people. Get your smokes.
No.
And the Iceman. Of course, don't have a lot of electric refrigeration, so you have the ice box, and the Iceman comes around and delivers your ice for you. Some of these folks are still using horse-drawn wagons and things. Of course, in the 30s, a lot of people were on the move. A lot of men and boys, but also some women. You know, there's 2 women that were riding with the Scottsboro boys that night. People get thrown out of their homes. They can't find work. So you're riding the rails, and there's this long tradition of this in America. You know, it's part of that Jack London thing. But sometimes you ride the rods, which is really dangerous. And you gotta be careful you don't fall asleep, or you don't get too cold, your hands get numb. And sometimes what they call the railroad bowls or railroad dicks would swing a billy club down under that thing, and that thing would bounce and stuff. And the railroad police can be really brutal to these hobos. This is an earlier picture, earlier in the century. But you know, you hear about a lot of these guys, they wouldn't have normally been on this situation, but they're on the move, and they would show up in town, and they would have a code. They would mark certain offense outside a house with a chalk code signal. Nice lady here. You do some work, you'll get a meal or something. And so it was not uncommon to see some guy out doing yard work or something who'd come in off the trains. The woman or wife would give him something to eat. But you know, not everybody's suffering in the Depression. A lot of people are still okay. And sometimes when things are bad, we're distracted by the high life. And there's this big thing in the 30s, particularly in the mid-30s on. I think this term celebrity was first coined in the 30s to look at the antics of these sort of the Paris Hiltons of their time. And this is Brenda Fraser. She's one of the most famous. And to see pictures of the Cafe Society and Cole Porter sitting there drinking scotch and smoking cigarettes and hanging out with Myrna Loy or whatever. You know, people, it's kind of an escape. This woman's actually going to become both anorexic and bulimic later on. So, Dick and Jane, this is just general 30s stuff here. Dick and Jane comes out in the 1930s and it's sort of replacing the old McGuffey system. Monopoly enters American life about 1935. This is a 35 Monopoly board. So it's a nice fantasy to play with that money. And this is the 1938 Daisy Red Rider. They think Gene Shepard, who wrote that, it did not have that compass in the stock and a thing that tells time. There was apparently some other kind of rifle at that time that had that feature, and he mixed it up with the Daisy Red Rider. That story is probably set about 1939 or so. Gene Shepard wrote that book, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash, was actually much older than the Ralphie character would have been. He served in the Signal Corps in World War II. But some people are disillusioned that he did not really live that. He made that story up. Of course, a lot of kids are going to listen to Little Orphan Annie and other shows, The Shadow and stuff. Make sure drink your Ovaltine. Be sure to drink that and enjoy your decoder pen. So you really do get a nice glimpse in the Depression life in that Christmas Story movie. I mean, just the settings, the houses they use, you can see the products in the back. They really create that Depression era feeling. Some familiar products. I'm surprised how much stuff we use today came out in the 1930s. A lot of stuff that's dropped by the wayside.
We almost lost Twinkies.
Yeah.
Even Lowry Season, I saw that story the other day. I had no idea it had been around that long.
Right, good.
The Twinkies had been resurrected.
House CCC's.
I never heard of that one.
Nestle Toll House.
That's the chocolate chip cookie.
Chocolate chip cookie.
There was a Greenhills High School teacher named Charlene Small, so I always talked about CCC's, chocolate chip cookie.
Wow.
These products came out this year, were developed. Freeze-dried instant coffee from Nescafe. The ballpoint pen.
Oh.
The photocopier is developed. Again, this is the first actual Xerox. Actually has the date on it. I believe this guy was a patent lawyer. Again, absorbing all this information. He wanted to, always dealing with these documents, wanted to be able to reproduce things. And that sort of necessity was the mother of invention. Nylon. DuPont develops nylon this year. One of the first products is the nylon toothbrush. Dr. West, Miracle Tuft toothbrush. And Mott's apple juice. I love this picture, this sharp, clear black and white of a 38 Packard. First one with air conditioning. And of course, the March of Dimes started by President Roosevelt, originally to combat polio in 38, celebrating their 75th. Now it's general child, infant and child health and mother's health, pregnant mothers. Still going strong. This, the coelacanth, is a living fossil. They thought this thing was extinct. You see pictures of these in the ocean, you think they're about this big. Look how enormous this thing is. This is, of course, a recent picture of one. But they found one of these off the coast of South Africa in late 35. So, this ginormous fish. That's a big scientific discovery this year. And just some enduring things from the 30s. I mentioned some of these products. Granddad, not you, Granddad. Shed Aquarium in Chicago. Granddad is the oldest fish in captivity, 80 years old. They say a lot of times, like they think of a person maybe in their 100s who's still alive, but sleeps a lot or something. They say he kind of lays on the bottom a lot. Sometimes looks like a log, kind of. All right. I'll get through the wonk stuff here real quickly. Fair Labor Standards Act. Deals a lot with minimum wage, child labor. Really, I think paper boys are the exception, but you really want to keep the kids out of that coal mine. Second Agricultural Adjustment Act. There's lots of stuff with. Let's see here. It has to do with like acreage allotments and quotas and buying up surpluses and things. There's an earlier Agricultural Adjustment Act. Fannie Mae is established. And unfortunately, it's not called this at the time. It is known as the Dyes Committee. But this guy had originally been pro-FDR, but he got concerned about the New Deal, and he establishes this committee that's really going to be thoroughly obnoxious later on in the 50s. HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and then the Civil Aeronautics Act. just a lot of regulation about flight routes and airports and things. So this is sort of more of the policy wonk stuff. But you can see that movement, that reform. We talked about early part of the century, things so wide open. Not a lot of structure. Putting that government structure in place, whether we like it. Maybe we've gone too far. Always that debate, have we gone too far, we have too much. But these things are also protections. And you can still see that Fair Labor Standards Act up in a lot of places where you go into work. First African American woman elected to a state house, Crystal Byrd Fawcett. She becomes a good friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's. So strides forward for women and black women with Crystal Byrd Fawcett's election. She's going to do all kinds of work related to poverty and social issues and things like that. Real interesting case. This guy wanted to be admitted to the University of Missouri Law School. It's a step toward Brown versus Board of Ed. This registrar's last name is Canada, refuses to let him enroll. And eventually the Supreme Court's going to rule states that provide a school to white students must offer one to blacks, either within or in a separate but equal facility. So it doesn't go all the way yet, but it's a step in that direction. The strange thing is this guy's going to vanish. We're not sure if he was murdered. He also had this habit of kind of like disappearing for days at a time. He was kind of a loner. Some people think he went off to Mexico. There's just no information. But a portrait of him does hang in the University of Missouri Law School. So, interesting court case. FDR's in this area, 38. In Covington. He's going to head up to Marietta and dedicate this monument, which is still there. Kind of dedicated to the Northwest Ordinance and the movement westward. How's that? That's like his typical expression almost. This is John L. Lewis. The CIO was originally within the AFL, and the CIO was an effort to industrial unionism versus just craft unions, people organized by their trade, because they want to be able to organize people in these, on these assembly lines and things like that. They're going to have this rift, and they're going to establish themselves as a totally separate entity in 38. This famously combative John L. Lewis, with those menacing eyebrows that he had. He's actually like one time he got in an argument, like just socked a guy on stage one time. They're having some kind of debate. Son of a Welsh coal miner, worked in the mines himself, starting at age 16. But an interesting thing this year is the Peace Light Memorial dedicated at Gettysburg, but this is part of something much bigger. It's the 75th reunion of the battle.
Wow.
This is the last time these veterans are going to gather there. These are a couple veterans flying over the field, being interviewed by NBC Radio. Just going back a bit, remember history's on a continuum. These things from the past come into our own lives. So we see the old vets on the field, but this is going back to what they experienced. Some people say it's the largest battle in the Western Hemisphere. Some people debate that. Some people say it might have been Midway or some other conflict. But just huge number, and of course, medical treatment is poor. So a lot of guys, if they're shot in the arm, their arm is going to be amputated. Some guys live with kind of open wounds for years. Some had to really fight to get pensions. And going back to the turn of the century, the Grand Army of the Republic was formed to advocate for Union veterans, and as part of that development of veterans advocacy in the U.S., you can still see some old GAR halls around the country, especially up in like New England. This is the only known picture of Lincoln in the time of the speech. The famous address. government of the people, by the people, for the people. This is a turning point. The war is going to get increasingly start to look like a modern kind of conflict with trench warfare and things toward the end. But Lincoln stating this purpose, country being reborn out of the sacrifice, shall not perish from the earth. Always need that vigilance for our freedom. This is Man of the Year for 1938. It's Adolf Hitler. So, a reminder. The last Confederate veteran is believed to be a guy named Pleasant Crump. That's his name. And they don't really have a photograph of him, but the Confederates just didn't have the records. And a lot of stuff was lost as the Confederacy crumbled. But we're pretty sure about these two men. Okay. The 30s are still with us in a lot of ways. Bonnie and Clyde. I was talking about Jack London earlier, that tension between all this sort of individual initiative and kind of wanted to be the top dog. Jack London had that in his life. But he also had this urge toward others, to help others, to make a better world. In 1938, Steinbeck is going to create this character, Tom Joad. In this famous speech from The Grapes of Wrath, this Henry Fonda, where he articulates his vision for a better world. Interesting example, I think, of a character who lives on, even though a fictional character, kind of lives on in the American conscience. Okay, getting toward the end, people are saying, we have a number of famous arrivals in 38. I'm just going to go through these. Died about 20 years old, early rock and roll musician. Listen to a lot of old rock music, and Buddy Holly would be 2 in 1938. Elvis would be 3. This little kid. We've been gone a long time now. She was in town about a couple of years ago. Does a lot of work with, I think, special needs students as like a foundation or something. I skip some, I'm going to go back. Okay, there. Okay, make sure I'm on track. Since we've been time traveling, I had to put that in at the end here, we're taking the trip back. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming out tonight.
Oh,
Appreciate it.
thank you.
Any questions?
I just wanted to ask, I know people had to apply to move into Greenhills, but were they taking applications for people to live in Greenhills at the same time they were doing it in Greenbelt and Greendale? Would,
Those towns came online earlier, we were the last.
we were the last?
Yeah, so I just, I'm not sure when exactly they started doing it, but it's pretty thorough vetting. I think maybe even the FBI kind of checked you out. They talked to your neighbors, they talked to your employer. They wanted to make sure that they weren't gonna have some kind of,
But did they have to live in Cincinnati? I was just wondering how.
yeah,
far
I think it
would
was like a residency requirement, the George sort of there. I believe someone might be able to answer that a little more definitely.
No, you're right.
Patrick, one of the interesting things we probably didn't mention was the great 1937 flood.
Right.
What was happening during the building of Greenhills, so
Right.
it was integrated into some of the themes as the mural in the old library, the library for the town, down the hall. Richard Zollner actually put that in his theme,
Yeah.
in his mural. He stopped everything and started sketching. He went down to the river, or down to the areas that were flooded, and actually entered it into his theme on the mural.
I think we started building in late 35.
It was December 1935 that we broke ground. I can't get over all the thoughts that were going through people's minds as they were moving to Greenhills, all the things they were dealing with in the world, and to see that some of the things they were reading throughout the world, and the people in Greenhills were dealing with those things and
Right.
starting a new life. It was amazing the things that you were showing us. It was like living their life through those slides you were showing. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just you're trying to get that context for what people lived through, and you know, it's kind of like been reading some stuff about 1963. Betty Friedan published The Feminist Mystique, or no, I'm not sure, something like that, The Feminine Mystique. And maybe a lot of people didn't read that at the time, but it came out and people were aware of it. And so sometimes you see these seeds of things that are going to flower later on. So, but yeah, it's just an amazing time. And we're just a few years away from our entrance into World War II.
That just struck me when you had those pictures of the people doing the acrobatic things on the planes. Would that have been about the same time people were going over Niagara Falls in barrels? I mean, there was just something that people wanted to do daredevil things.
Yeah, and flagpole sitting was a big thing in the 20s.
Was it?
Yeah, in Shipwreck Kelly, you know, the guy would sit on top of these flagpoles, and there was some kid in Baltimore, I think, and made his own in the backyard and sat on it for a while, and the mayor issued a proclamation saying he was in the pioneer spirit of America or something. I mean, it was just crazy kind of stuff. But there was a lot of that stuff, and, you know, just all kind of crazy stunts and things people would do.
Well, you had to be creative to make money because it was,
Sure.
you had to do crazy things to get people to pay for it, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. Well, if anybody, we've got all kind of refreshments here, 1930s themed stuff. I forgot to bring my Snickers and Butterfinger, which came out. They're so caught up in this, but I'll bring it
Toll House
next time.
cookies.
Toll House cookies over here.
Do we have chocolate chip?
We've got